Thanks for joining us. We're just getting going here this morning. The theme is reforestation, and you are, the Vice President of Research and Development at Mast Reforestation, and the interim General Manager of the Cal Forest Nurseries. And I understand you're going to talk a little bit about what Mast Reforestation's up to and some carbon offset opportunities you're digging into.
Yes, happy to speak on those topics and more. Thank you.
Awesome. Well, we'll get going here in just a second. We ready online? All right. You should have control to share your screen.
Okay, excellent.
All right, I'll turn it over.
Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting us to come out. If you bear with me just a moment, I'm going to pull up my slides and attempt to share in full screen. You have a full screen view.
We do.
Excellent. Okay, so first of all, thank you again for having us out here and for that introduction. A little more on my background. First and foremost, I'm a practitioner. So for the last 25 years, I've been working in all manner of artificial regeneration. So seedlings, production, science, plant physiology, and in a variety of settings, everything from academic to industrial and private forest management, nonprofit work, and then a lot of domestic work in the Western US, but also in other parts of the world. So my entire experience has basically been marching, in one direction, which is trying to figure out how we scale seed collection, scale seedling production, and do so in ways that are smart. And, there's a lot of interpretations of how to do that. And there are a lot of tools like the one we just heard about, which we use frequently. We use a variety of seed lot selection tools to make good decisions about where we're putting our genetic material. And we find that we always need to meet in the middle with the anecdote and experience of local practitioners to make those correct decisions. So been doing a lot of that work. And why that's relevant is, as we bring more companies like this one that I'll be speaking about today, Mast, online, and aim them at serving reforestation pipelines, which is the new nomenclature used to catch what has otherwise been artificial regeneration practices and supply chains. As we bring these online, we want to have a very practical head about us. And we want to develop technologies and processes that actually allow this to be scaled in a way that meets our societal needs, meets the size of the challenges that we're attempting to address, but also is done so in a way that is sustainable. And this is something that really I'm struggling with because, as I go through my talk, there's a lot of optimism and development and things that we're working on, but we have to caveat this in that, all of this requires capital, and all of this requires a persistent management. And, these are hard things to incentivize. And to frame this differently, there are quite a bit of, boom and bust cycles coming from federal funds, from, even capital markets. Even, when in the mills are taking logs, it's a great time to be harvesting, right? So we have these boom and bust cycles, but things like artificial regeneration, which are expensive, logistically complex, and don't necessarily see a return on investment till years down on the road, need to be sustained if we're going to not only create a baseline, but catch up with the backlog. So, part of how I want to view this, and I want you to view this and perhaps ask questions and pick away at our solution, is figuring out how we can make this more sustainable so it can have the appropriate decadal or century-long outlook in terms of capital investments, innovations, and moving this progress forward. So with that, I'll get started. And I'll note that I have two presentations teed up today. I'll keep this one moving along, but it's really an overview of Mast as a vertically integrated reforestation company. But we were previously known as Drone Seed. So we have a whole technology platform that we built out So I have an entire slide deck. If there's interest there, we can kind of piecemeal go through that either in the Q&A, or I can follow up with folks afterwards and showcase some of the process and data that we have to show off there. Let me see if this will let me click through. Here we go. So MAST is effectively a vertically integrated company that brings together the old and the new. Drone Seed still exists. It's still going to be a pioneer in technological solutions for reforestation. You know, most people think drones as an automated, seed dispenser and something that comes off the shelf. It's actually quite different than that. These are aircraft that we built that are regulated the same way as like a 747, for example. So, a lot of what we designed are industrial solutions. And also drone doesn't necessarily mean aircraft. There are a lot of robotics that can be nested under this title. So there are a number of other uses that we're actually working on that can help with automation of processes along the supply chain. And these other companies all bring collectively a lot of supply chain weight to our capabilities. And, we've been slowly working with these companies over the last decade. And then, we made the acquisitions over the last 2 years, which I'll share more about here shortly. But ultimately, MAST is this solution that brings together the conventional and the technological to kind of make a path forward. Why is this necessary? Well, we've been looking at a decline in reforestation from a programmatic perspective across any manner of industry, agency, and otherwise, partly because the incentives have changed. Timber basically contracted, at least in the western part of the United States that I'm in right now. I'm in Washington. And the Northwest Forest Plan really saw a decline in harvesting on agency lands. And as a result, some of that impacted the ecosystem of service providers, and then also how the TMOs and REITs were managing their landscapes as well. So artificial regeneration really became more of a, necessary, line item in, a sustainable forestry model. And as these programs kind of declined, you saw a decline of the entire ecosystem of practitioners and service providers now for about 3 decades. So we're not seeing a lot of robust capabilities, even in the most experienced, companies. So that's a challenge. Technology has not been in the forefront of forestry on this side of the silvicultural regime. And that actually means that the folks that were on the smaller side of operations, like restoration groups, riparian management, cultural plantings, urban plantings, they all suffered as well. It was a race to the bottom on price for how cheap can we make seedlings and regeneration. And then that really reflects in the state of the art today. Similarly, there's just not a lot of professionals that have been incentivized to work in this sector, both skilled and unskilled labor. As an example, I went through 3 different institutions, both learning and teaching, all R1s from, Indiana to Idaho to Washington. And at all 3, I was in forestry programs. And unless I was teaching it, there was no curriculum designed around seed collection, seedling, production for industrial forestry. I think the University of Idaho has the last or maybe the only Center for Forest Nursery and Seedling Research. And that is a bit scary considering the challenge that we have ahead of us with staffing and then providing professional decisions to the unskilled labor force that we need to mobilize these changes. And on top of all this, we're dealing with a backlog of wildfires, active wildfires that are raging at a scale that is insurmountable with current supply chains. And in addition to that, a variety of other disturbances that don't get enough attention paid to them as well, which includes drought events, beetle kill, and so on. So again, with all this federal funding and all this motivation that we have in conversation, the risk is really we end up in this state of analysis paralysis. And by the time the funding gets metabolized, we haven't actually done anything about it or done anything about it fast enough where we can actually make an impact. So, we've been looking at this for almost a decade now and kind of beating our own drum and saying, like, how is it that we can actually do something now? And So I'll showcase some of our accomplishments as a way to kind of frame how we're approaching it, and then hopefully get some good questions. And, we love the criticism too of like how we can tune this further to kind of build a machine that works and build an incentive structure that works and continue to kind of pioneer on this side of the supply chain. One of the things that I really am excited about is the willingness of my colleagues in this company to really focus in on one of the fundamental problems in the supply chain, which is just having a seed inventory. We can have a lot of discussions and abstractions about, well, how do we correctly use seed? Is orchard seed better than wild seed? And then every permutation of that. But what's most important is just having seed at all. And if we look at all the Western seed zones and even places where we don't have seed zones and have just ecoregions, or basically we could look at all these places and we'll find that there isn't a lot of seed in reserve in public or private hands. And so a number of years ago, we effectively panicked on behalf of everyone, because I've spent probably 15 to 20 years going and looking at everybody's coolers and trying to understand the problem. And we realized there was no more analysis to be done. We simply needed to get started. So part of the story I want to tell today is like how we've gotten started here, and also make some offers and how we can help Alaska, among other states that have not had this as a priority, kind of revitalize this process and kind of get local efforts in addition to regional efforts started that can actually put seed in the bank. Okay, let's shift gears a little bit and go through the deck here. So this is going to struggle a bit, but effectively what this video is showing you is, not meant to be hyperbolic, but well, maybe a little. This is what our, mornings look like most days after August, and it goes on for about 4 or 5 months. We drive around the West. We're invited to see various landscapes that have, burned and have burned in catastrophic high intensity wildfires. And typically, unlike a lot of the prime timberlands, your site 1, site 2s, these are site 3, site 4 skeletal soils, incredibly complex, remote, not a lot of civil engineering or infrastructure developed, so the access is tricky. And this is really what we're targeting first and foremost with both the technology, so being able to access these with aircraft like the drone systems, but also with the logistical supply chains with the conventional approach as well. Because if we don't get to these areas fast enough, not only are they immense and enormous, but they're this vacuum, and nature loves a vacuum. So the thing that reestablishes and emerges here is typically basically a large weed patch. We'd like to think that this is the resurgence of an early seral system with high biodiversity, the way we really have learned this in our, basic ecology courses. But the reality is most of these areas are fairly disturbed, and the size of these fires and the intensities means that there's no healthy seed source. And the thing that is establishing are typically these very aggressive invasive species. And because of the heat, that low albedo, the drought, and a lot of other conditions that exacerbate this, and the lack of seed flowing in, effectively you could have this persistent early seral phase that sustains for well beyond the decade that you would expect in some of these southern latitudes, and might persist for decades. And a lot of the models and academic work are really supporting this anecdote I'm sharing with you, which is, we're seeing this failure of natural regeneration, and as a result, this is really, again, incentivizing action and urgency in our approach. So let's talk about the pipeline a little bit. This is something I think about all day long and for my entire career. And so I feel that this is reductive, but I also realize that when I show up and there's 30 steps on a flow chart, people go cross-eyed and look at me like something's wrong with me. So I've distilled this down into 10 steps. And, I think these are a healthy way to look at it, because, each one of these is not only a production or a logistical operation, but it's a handoff. And anyone who's worked in, forestry probably has experienced some degree of this. And And another way to look at this is if I'm a landowner, whether I'm a mom and pop forestry operation, a mid-sized landowner, a TMO or REIT, or an agency, no matter what, if I get hit by fire, like the last image you saw, each one of these is a separate phone call or thing that I need to coordinate in order to get trees back on the ground. And that doesn't even include how to fund it, whether it's insurance or otherwise. And it doesn't necessarily guarantee that I can do this in a time frame that is manageable so that I am not dealing with increased cost because of the weeds that I have to mechanically site prep or any other complexity that is unforeseen. So these steps really distill, what we've been focusing on consolidating in one turnkey service. And we find that our approach is useful because it allows that landowner, regardless if they're a private or public landowner, to skip from, 5, 6, coordinating calls down to one. And, it also means that if we're dealing with a forester on behalf of a landowner or any other land management professional, they're similarly getting a turnkey experience. So that means the quality of the communication, the work, and the execution can be much higher and much faster. So things like seed planting, seed collection, if it's necessary, working with an extractory and a laboratory to validate that that seed is useful and of a quality that is sufficient for the nursery, making sure that the nursery is going to sow the appropriate number of seedlings. Seedling production is going to go off without a hitch and in a timely manner because that matters. The prescription was written correctly and will continue to be dynamic so that site preparation happens on time. And then, of course, the supply chain of shipping seedlings anywhere in the Western US, Alaska, Baja, Mexico, anywhere within our reach, that is done on time, maintains the viability of this living organism or organisms, and is ultimately transported in sites so that the labor can meet it there and put it in the ground root side down. And the most important piece is accountability. So being able to monitor, tend to that stand, and actually feed that loop back so we can improve every time we have a touch point on that or other landscapes. So this is a really important logistical process, and I think it's often overlooked or handed off to vendors. And that's why we've seen some of the quality issues in reforestation accountability, and then the lack of scalability in at least the lower US, lower states. So how have we evolved to kind of get here? Because we were just drone seed in everyone's mind not too long ago. Well, we were founded in 2016, and the mission was scale technology so that we can scale reforestation to mitigate the worst effects of climate change. And it's, a bit of a tall order, but it's a great way to get a lot of motivated people to rally behind a cause. And our initial investments were very much in research and development and technology development. And that's why the drone seed brand was working for us quite well. And early on, we were addressing these marginal areas. So things like herbicide application in difficult terrain where helicopters were becoming less and less safe and useful. Aerial seeding in these 15 to 20% of lands that we didn't have civil infrastructure for. This made sense. So that's what we aimed ourselves at. But as we continued to kind of build that machine, we were realizing there are a number of other missing pieces in the supply chain that no one else was working on outside of the timber industry. And no one else was trying to consolidate outside of, some versions of this in the timber industry. So if the motivation wasn't timber, how would we build this thing? And that's really how we shifted gears. And in the meanwhile, all of this is expensive: drones, seed collection, seedling production. And if we're going to pay people appropriate wages and incentivize work, whether they're a forester or a migrant worker that's planting trees, we need to kind of figure out a way to capitalize the entire system so we can sustain that incentive to actually hit the scale that we want to work on. So we started to look at the carbon markets very skeptically because, they kind of looked and felt like a Ponzi scheme. But we realized that as these things are evolving, there's going to be a quality separation. And it turns out there was. And there's a way to address high quality production and high quality credits. And so we've kind of associated ourselves with a very challenging but appropriate quality metric that creates a high degree of accountability. And we work with ex-ante credits. And there's a lot of details there that I won't bore you with. But effectively, we pioneered the removal of carbon credits from a landscape, selling them to voluntary purchasers, and effectively figuring out a way to incentivize post-wildfire restoration using that model. And once we demonstrated that model, we figured out there was a way to basically have that money trickle down to the landowners, to the service providers, to the innovation, to everything that needed to happen with plenty of margins to walk away for that landowner and others involved in this process. So with that, we were very pleased and effectively built the rest of the pipeline so that we can continue to scale this process and serve not only private lands, but public lands as well. So since that time, we had acquired Silvaseed. We continue to build out that end-to-end forestry solution. We built out a forestry operations team. We got really good at logistics and rapid response to these, phone calls that come in after a wildfire. And as we kind of scaled up, we realized we need more capacity to collect seed, more capacity to grow seedlings. So we took on Cal Forest Nurseries most recently. And we have some other announcements, but really this is the end-to-end solution that we're showcasing today. Is with this group of companies all under the Mast brand and a variety of capabilities now that allow us to be this very responsive organization. Most people get fixated on the drones, so I'll share a little bit about this. And then if you're more interested, I can pull up some more shiny images and some data actually of how this went. But this isn't our big focal area right now because we're just in execution mode. So the way I think about the drones is really they're a tool in our toolbox. So if we need them, we pull that arrow out of the quiver, if you will, and we add it to the prescription. But in most cases, we're still using conventional processes and adding technology there. Things that we innovated here included FAA regulations. Because our aircraft were so big and so technically capable, we had to be regulated the same way as professional aircraft. We built an herbicide platform, a seeding platform. We worked on seed enablement technology. We're going to publish some more papers on this year, actually, so you'll learn more about that. But the data suggests that we were able to basically reduce the quantity of seed use compared to conventional aerial seeding significantly by using our seed vessels, the pucks. And then we really got good at logistics because it's not about just having drones out in the field. You got to build trucks that can power these systems. You have to have crews that know how to operate professionally. A lot of former military logisticians are actually our pilots and our coordinators for this part of the business. And as a result, they've been absorbed into other parts of the forestry operation. So we've been able to innovate there. And then we've been using these tools to scale commercial seed collection. So being able to kind of up level the availability of seed so that we're putting 100 times more seed into the bank than we're using for this or for nursery use, which is all in all a win. And then as we kind of move forward, with the technology, oh, by the way, this is what a puck looks like in a lab scenario. Basically, the premise here is this fiber vessel that could be manufactured in a way that engineers won't revolt when you ask them to put a bunch of them on an aircraft. And it's an exercise in biomimicry. So instead of over-engineering some bullet or torpedo or seed ball, we basically made something that works in a way that increases the likelihood that the seed will survive and thrive on a site by creating a little microenvironment around it and adding some additives. And it's got a white degradable paper on it because we have these low albedo burn sites. There's a lot of advantages. It's square instead of round, so it doesn't roll. I can share more about this if you're interested. But moving on, we acquired Silvaseed. Those of you who haven't heard of this company, it's been around for about 130 years. It was previously known as Manning Seed Company. So before we had the federal seed zones, Manning Seed Company was already out collecting and providing seed to the forestry industry. So in the 1880s, 90s, early 1900s. And so they found themselves in a position where they had to actually build their own Manning seed zone. So every once in a while, you'll be in an old forestry office and you'll see a poster of the Manning seed zones, which later informed, the federal agencies and the academic groups in their work to up level the seed zones and make our modern seed zones, which have been around since about the 70s. And it's kind of amazing because, slight aside, despite there not being a regulatory mechanism to adhere to the seed zones, adherence is really high. And this is a really good thing because at the very least, we have this standard that increases the likelihood of success of seed transfer, seed collection back to site. And, a lot of, again, what was discussed this morning and where we're heading in the future is up leveling that with, additional information and data. But that puts accountability on us to actually have a higher granularity of data and where we're collecting, not only at the tree or stand level, but at the geography and niche envelope level. So we're working on that. But with Silvaseed, we got 130 years of experience as a commercial certified seed collection group. And, they've been doing work from Alaska to the Western United States to as far south as Baja. And believe it or not, we still have a bunch of Alaska seed in the bank from collection operations that happened in the 80s, 90s, early 2000s. We love to share that with anybody that, needs it. It's as simple as a phone call, looking at our retail listing, if anything matches, and going from there. This is also a nursery. So this is one of the places where stock types were innovated. So right now the styroblock is a standard used in most of North America. This was one of the first places to test and run with that Beaver Plastics product. And we continue to innovate at this center. In fact, back in the 50s, it's funny that Drone Seed acquired Silvaseed, because back in the 50s, they were the first aerial seeding company to really scale up in the Western US. So they had a fleet of helicopters and were doing a ton of aerial seeding, and it's kind of just come full circle now. I mentioned that we acquired Cal Forest Nurseries. Why this is important is this is one of the largest production houses for conifers in the Western US, and they ship seedlings pretty much everywhere west of the Mississippi. This is an industrial nursery, and it's built at a scale that really is supported by a community level operation, but serves this really broad landscape of primarily industrial, but also non-industrial landowners, federal landowners. We grow probably 4 million seedlings for the Forest Service. Several state groups around the West are buying seedlings here. And then I think for California, we grow 96% of all reforestation seedlings. And for the greater West, we probably grow like 10 to 15%. So it's a huge operation. And why this is important as part of our company is this capability to kind of say yes whenever we're faced with these big, challenges. When we get that phone call saying we have this incredible fire that we don't know where to start with, the very least we can leverage this and Silvaseed to start problem solving. Do we set up some new production areas? Do we run our playbook as a satellite somewhere else? Do we do it in-house? How can we adapt and troubleshoot instead of having to have a 5-year, we're going to stand it up, build it, do the analysis, find the capital. We have that capability as a baseline available to start problem solving. With Cal Forest came Siskiyou Seed, so it's another seed bank. Right now, the majority of the bank is full of industrial land seed holdings. So we do that as a service as well. So a lot of orchard seed, a lot of commercial tree seed that just needs to be somewhere safe and with resources to manage it, correctly. We're happy to do that as a service, but what we're trying to do is also make this a satellite facility of Silvaseed so that we have another place where we can collect and bank seed for all the private non-industrial landowners, non-agency landowners, all the forgotten patches of land that really do need to be represented by the seed bank. So in California, this is a really important resource, but we want to use that as a model to look at other Western regions. So the Intermountain region, places like Colorado, Alaska is very much in our sights. And I'd love to discuss this with anyone who's interested in setting up some sort of mechanism to get seed collection back online there. We've got the playbook. How can we help? Okay. So the last half of this is really looking at these systems and driving towards this carbon piece. So our challenges that we're focused on is better systems to incentivize and scale labor, address the limited seed supply, and then we want to make sure that seedlings are not the limiting factor in the project, and it's really more about execution. And so that operational capacity needs to be paired with number 4, which is, there's a significant lack of reforestation finance. So we want to make sure we can actually move the needle on funding more projects so that landowners can react immediately. And so we've got a great model to do that, and we can talk a little bit about that. First, I kind of want to set an expectation. And on the scaling labor side, I've heard all sorts of really nice ideas. They're cute, if you'll allow me. But over the last 25 years, I'll tell you, I have not seen a volunteer army or any sort of like goodwill initiative actually incentivize this really hard work that needs to happen. So yes, there are technological solutions, but if we're actually going to impact scale, we need to mobilize, armies of people. And the more skilled workers paired with unskilled workers, the better the outcome. And so, a lot of people always say, well, we should revitalize something like the CCC or have some sort of volunteer brigade. And I'm like, these are nice ideas, but let's look at this. The CCC was at the right time in the right place. We do not have the social or the political will to have a program like this, in my opinion. If you think otherwise, let's debate it. Second of all, I don't think the CCC was as simple and turnkey as we look at it. If you think about just the demography, these were military-age men that were leaving rural areas for urban centers during the Dust Bowl, during an economic collapse. They knew what hard labor was because they grew up on farms. So when you handed them a shovel, that was not that big of a deal. Whereas now, the demography of many people that age, men and women, are college educated or have a very different ideal of how they're going to spend their time. So if you were to give them barely a stipend and a tent, there's not a high likelihood that they're going to go out and start planting trees for you at $1,200 a day for, cents on the tree. So that's one element of it. The other element is the CCC was, quite a formidable machine, and they didn't just plant trees. It took them 10 years to plant 3 billion trees. But in order to plant that, they had to actually work their way through building the roads, building the civil infrastructure, building the camps, building the process. So they built the machine that later planted the trees, the nurseries, the seed collection, all that stuff. And 3 billion trees sounds like a lot over 10 years, but that's what we plant in the US annually at a minimum, serving industrial operations. And we need to double that just to hit some of the targets that have been proposed, both for meeting some of our climate targets, but also just because of the disturbances that we're encountering in terms of fire, beetle kill, and other things that have kind of put a backlog on our plates. So I like to share this. We've written a paper about this and some other topics about outplanting, but it's mostly to say that in order to create a labor force here, we really need to create incentives that are reasonable. So what does our labor force look like? And at least in the lower 48, it's mostly H-2B visa workers that are planting the majority of trees. So folks from Mexico, Guatemala, and other Central American countries are quite common. I would say more than 70% of the workforce. There's a limit on how many of those visas are available, and the majority of them are serving the industrial forestry base. And that's really important. We shouldn't be messing with our fiber and timber economies. So we need to create a net new capacity for tree planting. So does that mean more visas? Yes, but that also means new incentives. And then if we look at the CCC for any lessons, it should be all that support infrastructure. So not only good wages, but all the camps, the mess halls, the dining, the lodging, the entire logistical pathway being consolidated under one entity so that it isn't a nightmare for these folks to actually be able to get out to site and do their work and not suffer. The incentive is to not only have them come do the work, but to sustain that work over time. And, the Canadians have a good model for this, but it's not necessarily something we can scale in the lower 48 because the seasonality of it doesn't quite work out with like college, breaks, and we don't necessarily pay the right per seedling, incentive. And on top of that, I'm not necessarily sure the culture here would allow for it. Now, in Alaska, I'd love to learn more. When we did the surveys and wrote the paper on this, we didn't actually get a lot of respondents from Alaska. So if there's anyone that can educate me on, how planting operations are done and how incentives are structured, I'd love to learn more about that and see if we can work on that as well. Another piece of this, if we're going to move it forward, is just technology investments, supply chain investments, and creating ecosystems of service providers that can actually be sustained over time. So again, this is really important. So if timber is not the incentive and that return on investment isn't the duration of a rotation, so 40, 60, 80 years out or longer in some cases, then can we use carbon and other valuation of ecosystem service to actually return that return on investment into something that's in less than 5 years for the landowner and all these service providers? And if that's the case, can we have that trickle down, that capital, to all of these workers in a way that incentivizes them to come back year over year and more of them to come forward? And then more foresters, because they're getting more projects over the line, better wages, to actually live and work on the land for longer periods, as opposed to bouncing around, which happens quite a bit in the lower 488, to different land bases. Because really, those skilled professionals being tied to the land creates better outcomes, over time. So now let's talk about seed supply. What have we been doing here? So, I can sit here and proselytize about we need to collect more seed. There's plenty of people doing that. But the important piece is really we've proved it and we've developed a model. So we use that old silver-seed technique, which uses several collection styles, squirrel cache collections, which work in Western wet systems, but more importantly, professional collections, which are involving getting out with surveys, which could be foresters or other people reporting mast or seed, cone-bearing trees, and then feeding that back to our professional teams, which go out and validate that, identify when ripening is going to happen through cone cutting, and then we send out professional crews that are typically consisting of climbers, and these climbers are able to, get up into the canopies of these select trees, stands, or groups of, stands, and effectively collect a bunch of data and the cones together, which gets put into a logistical pipeline, bunch of bushel sacks that ultimately end up at our extractory in Roy, Washington. And we've, been able to scale this and other fell and pick techniques working with logging operations to the point where we're collecting over the last few years, we've collected more, bushels of seed and more seed in our banks than any other agency and private group combined for all of the Western states. So something like 14,000 bushels in 21 and 22. And why this is relevant is all of that seed now represents, I think, 50 more geographies and ecoregions, and is now sitting tested, cleaned, validated by a third-party lab and in our seed bank. And unlike every other entity, agency, or otherwise that we see out there, there's no restriction for who can access our seed. It's a simple retail experience. So call us, and if you say, hey, my seed zone, my project are here, and we have something for you, if you're willing to pay the per pound price, it's yours. There's an unrestricted access. And on top of that, if you're not sure what to do with the seed, we'll hook you up with the process that connects it to a nursery. Or if you really like, we can give you the funding and the entire end-to-end solution. So this is something that we're able to basically do and expand west and north and south because we're putting this into the pipeline immediately for projects. So both just providing this as a service until other entities come online with capabilities here is going to be important, but also as a way to serve our ability to run that whole end-to-end process is going to be important. So our offer, we'd love to support scouting, collections, and seed processing for Alaska. Silvaseed has done this. They did it since the 50s and 60s. I talked to some of the old guys that are still around that ran the show, and they may even have some contacts out there that we can, rustle out of the brush. And so the one thing that'll be a limiting factor for us being able to do this is really land access and permitting. As many of you know, seed doesn't grow every year unless, you're in an orchard where you're stimulating. But for wild seed collections from wild populations, we really need land access. We don't want to be trespassing to do this. So there are, in some cases, permits you can buy, but those $5 permits that you can go pick mushrooms or cones with are really kind of a drop in the bucket. What we're looking for are commercial access permits for public lands, for private lands, et cetera. So we build these relationships, and we've been building them across the Western landscape. And we haven't had many conversations with Alaska. We've had a few, but we'd like to have some more. Any ownership. And if we can establish that access, then we can actually teach local practitioners how to use our playbook to do this work. And the cool thing is you won't need to build up an extractory in the meantime. You can just figure out a way to get cones on a ferry or on a truck down here, and we'll take care of it. We'll test it, and that will be on a shelf for whoever collected it, or we'll buy it off of you and incur that expense in hopes that we can do a project up there later when the timing is right. So we'd love to have these conversations if folks are ready. A model for this working to serve public entities also exists. So We went to Montana. We found out they had a few Gatorade coolers with some kind of rotten seed, and we're like, oh no. How do we actually get ourselves a seed bank here? And then how do we help also all the private landowners that aren't represented in the public seed bank? So we went to the DNRC, the Forest Service, the BLM, and the Nature Conservancy, and at least 3 of the groups, the DNRC, the BLM, and the Nature Conservancy, said game on. And we got land access agreements, and we create these very favorable contracts because we want to build that trust where if we get the land access, we'll actually run the entire collection playbook. And from whatever seed we haul off of that site in the given year, if there's mast, we'll clean it, we'll process it, we'll bank it. We'll just donate a bunch to the banks. And most of these agencies don't want to take anything for free. So we figure out some arbitrary price, like, 50 cents a pound or whatever it is, but we get that seed in the bank. So now these agencies have an operating capacity to start with from these seed. And also why this is good is because we got access to these public lands where you have these typically genetic reserves, all the landowners around them, whether they're private, tribal, or otherwise, that don't have these capacities or agreements in place, they can all benefit because whatever we didn't provide the agency, we actually have banked and now it's available to the entire landscape. So it's a win-win. And it's really a landscape level mentality. And this is kind of what we're trying to promote and move forward. Okay, let's talk about seedling production. I'm wrapping up here. So we also wanted to innovate in how nurseries operate. And you can imagine if you have a year where there's 10 million acres of fire and beetle kill and need, and then you have a year that's maybe only half of that or a fraction of that, that can be a really turbulent way to run a business or an agency run nursery. And that's one of the reasons in the 80s and 90s, we saw the decline of federal nurseries, in my opinion, and based on the data, really. We used to have 20 federal nurseries and extractories. I think we have 6 now. Similarly, we had probably 50 or more nurseries that were privately owned, but I think we have, a half dozen now that are corporately owned, between PRT, IFA, and our system. And why is that? Well, because there was a boom in need for seedlings. But then when the market and demand contracted, a lot of small operations and federal operations went out of business. Those funding cycles closed. So we're trying to develop a system that allows for flexible production and develop a stock type that is more suited to not just timber, but also all these other types of site conditions. So we've been building that over the last few years. And this flex production means we're potentially creating an opportunity to have satellite facilities that can benefit from this production strategy. So again, happy to share more about this if there's interest, because I think Alaska fits the bill as, a place that doesn't have a big nursery system, but may benefit from them occasionally. A little purview into some of our stock types. Those of you who think about seedlings a lot this will resonate, but the styro block is kind of a false narrative that the entire scientific community, of which I'm part of, had done research. We did stock type research, and really it was just doing styro block research and the occasional other sortable cell. Now we're looking at membrane systems and other types of truly other types of stock type, and then doing that relative comparison to kind of look at what kind of morphologies are actually better suited for things like drought-ridden sites, post-fire sites, or simply just difficult site conditions where we couldn't get site prep. And we're trying to think about this in a non-timber faceted way. So really expand the breadth of what's being done. And so before we kind of flood the academic sphere with all these papers, we've just went ahead and started trialing this in parallel to some of these research efforts, which will take longer. So if there's any interest in trying some of these stock types, we can go ahead and develop some quick and dirty back of the envelope operational trials and work with you to try some of these things and create that feedback loop that'll allow for us to be ready when we really need them at scale. And finally, the carbon piece. And I'm probably not I'm the practitioner on the seedling side, the seed side, probably not the most articulate when it comes to carbon markets, and I'm probably the most skeptical. But I'd like to share with you a model that we found that works. And then if there are more interests in discussion here that go into really the weeds of how this works, I can connect you with the right folks on my team. But generally, we figured out this mechanism to fund both public and private land forestry projects through an end-to-end service provider. That's us. So we'll show up and we'll try to finance the project, and then we'll be able to run our entire playbook. And the way this works is very similar to how a lot of leasing structures have worked, like extraction industries, grazing, oil and gas, mineral extraction. We've figured out a model that if we can work with a specific land base or land area that needs this treatment, we can effectively take it on, put it under an agreement that allows for us to have a longer connection to that landscape. And then we typically leverage local service providers, so local consulting foresters or forestry professionals that are tied to that land base, because we think that's a more appropriate model. And we give them the backing of our forestry teams and our end-to-end supply chain to actually work on that landscape, whether it's the seed collection and seedling production, or everything up or downstream that's required to actually get trees in the ground, create that accountability, monitor them, verify them. We'll sell the credits. We'll make that capital back for the land base. Well, we have even a small insurance pool if there's another disturbance event, so that we can react to that and, again, take seed out of the bank and run the model again. And we're trying to run this in a way that isn't plantation minded. It's really focused on a resilient landscape. So we've got this model in place. It looks something like this, where effectively, if we engage with you, we'll start with the scoping and design process. We'll begin that project site planning. We'll move on to preparation and implementation. And then ultimately we're tied together with that land base, depending on how the easement or agreement have been structured, so that, we have a 50-year or more, ideally, outlook in how we can actually maintain that landscape as a carbon sink, but also as a source of timber, fiber, ecosystem services in some measured way. It's early days for this marketplace, so we've positioned ourselves to really focus on the high quality and accountability piece, which separates us from all the brokers who just want to make the deal, get the carbon and run. I think that's going to be important in the long run. We'll see this as a general trend, so we're pioneering here. And that also means we're very flexible in how we're having these conversations and deliberating. We're very patient with agencies that haven't quite figured out how they're going to do this at the state or federal level. So we're having those conversations, we're building the processes, and we've got an entire group of people that are dedicated to making sure we do this correctly. So I'd love to talk about this more with you. So with all that, I'm going to wrap up. And these are kind of the salient points, and take any questions if there are any. If not, my contact information I can put into the chat, and happy to follow up with anybody.
Thanks, Matthew. So we're on break until 10, but we have a couple, we'll eat into the break a little bit for some questions. So I'll open that up. There's a question. Oh, no, it's asking for questions. Oh, I've got a question back here.
We have a lot of native corporation and state lands with recent bark beetle kill. The lands probably won't be replanted without help. Do you think your group can help? I suspect that we can help. You saw all the elements of the supply chain that we're working on. If it isn't the whole model, we're more than motivated to actually apply any of the individual pieces. So the answer is yes. We would like to help. The only way to figure out if there's a way that we can is to have a conversation. So my email is in here, and we have a long history of working with native groups here in the lower 48, and we'd be happy to have that conversation. Oh, all of a sudden the audio's back.
Oh, you hear this?
Okay.
Yes.
Oh, awesome. Here we go. We've got just a few minutes, so we'll have to make it quick.
Oh, great. Hi, I'm Ann Erickson. I'm from the Bureau of Land Management, Alaska State Office. And I came in a little late, but I did pick up the last part where you were the carbon, and you were thinking about how to lease the land to sort of use it for, the benefit of the public, and then, sell back the credits or whatever. And I don't know if you're aware of this, but the BLM just published a public land order that basically brings conservation up with the same level as uses by FLPMA. And so there's a conservation lease that should be available. Not quite sure how this is going to get rolled out, but would be a very good fit for that. So keep that in mind.
Definitely. We did see that actually, and Our experience with a lot of these conversations is the palatability is different depending on the state or the region. Our experience is that a lot of the Western states that have extraction industries, grazing, and other experiences just are more familiar with this model. So we're hoping that it's less painful to look at the conservation lease as an opportunity to kind of benefit, reforestation when compared to some of the contracting they've done on the other side. So yeah, that's a great call out. Thank you.
Thanks, Matthew. All right, I think we're going to move to break here, but thanks for your time. That was a lot, Matthew, and we will grab your contact information and distribute it. So
yeah, sorry about the audio issues if I missed anything, but thanks again for having me. Y'all take care.
All right, thank you.